Good day, everyone. I'm 32 years old, and I'm a philosophy teacher. I teach philosophy and ethics in high school in the Netherlands. That's where the accent is from. And I've always been interested in politics, so political philosophy is my major interest. And before I became a teacher, I used to work in finance, so that was very interesting. So through my job, I got some education in economics. Today I'm talking to Derek, who is a universal basic income advocate in New York, and he's been advocating that for a while. He made quite a journey. I'll let him introduce himself.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Derek. I'm a cameraman and filmmaker from Brooklyn. I got interested in basic income a couple of years ago. I've always sort of been interested about politics, sort of economics on the periphery of my other interests. I was more of an arts person. But the last couple of years, I've gotten much more into that, philosophy, politics, and that just led me to economics. And after sort of studying that for a while and trying to figure out problems from that perspective, it just led me into basic income kind of naturally. I sort of started out assuming that something like universal basic assets would be awesome for the economy and for society, and I sort of fell into basic income after that because I was convinced through the arguments that this was just the most efficient way to go about it, the best way to go about solving the goal of maximizing people's prosperity, giving people the most possible access to goods and resources that they need. So that's how I ended up there.
Gotcha. And so the main things that we sort of disagreed on, well, we didn't disagree on a lot. So I mentioned that I'm not an advocate for universal basic income for three main reasons, right? I think there are better ways of redistributing wealth, be there assets or money. I don't see any credible sum that could be universal and basic. For example, well, handicapped people need a more substantial amount of money than non-handicapped people and non-disabled people. And the same goes for, well, different regions. For example, a person living on the countryside in Arkansas might need more substantial means of getting the same basic needs fulfilled than somebody living in a very urban developed area like I think Brooklyn is, right? Brooklyn is kind of developed.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and the third point, of course, being, well, the specter of inflation. At least the way I understand economics, universal basic income would inflate the money supply and push down on prices at the same time. So that would lead to, well, quite strong inflation, right? So what would be your response to those three sort of things that make me on the fence about universal basic income?
Well, on the number one, better ways of redistribution, we could talk about that. I'd like to hear what you sort of prefer, because it's useful to really compare the models, right? Otherwise, we don't know what we're comparing it to. But as far as the other 2 points, the first thing I would clarify is that it is true that many basic income advocates frame basic income in terms of the intention of it is to provide people a level that's sufficient to meet their basic needs. And I don't look at basic income that way. For me, what makes it basic is that it's a starting point. Everybody gets it, and you can add stuff on top of it. And I personally would see no reason why we should limit that amount to just what we think people might basically need for their basic survival requirements. I don't even know how we could calculate that. That would be very hard to figure out, because people actually need different amounts of things. I mean, it depends on not just on where you live, but also your personal preferences and choices. It depends on a lot, right? So I think that's kind of a waste of time. I think the real question is, how much basic income can we afford? If we could afford to make everybody better off, if our economy is capable of doing that without causing problems like inflation, that would be good. It would be good to try to achieve that, to see how much prosperity we could actually achieve for people. And you're correct to suggest that inflation is certainly a limit, actually a really important limit, on not only how much basic income we can afford, but also all possible government spending and private sector spending in the economy. We can't overclaim the economy's real capacity to produce goods. If that occurs, well, all prices start to rise across the economy. And what that means is that not all prices are rising. What it means is that your currency is worth less. So we've overpromised the economy's capacity to produce goods for people. So my contention is simply that there is an amount of basic income we can afford that does not cause inflation, and I don't see why that amount shouldn't be as high as possible. I think that obviously if we can make everybody richer, we should want to do that. That would be good for people. Being richer is better than being poorer. And what I like about basic income is that it goes to everyone. So by definition, that means that you're raising how poor the poorest person in society can possibly get. And from my perspective, that's an improvement to the current system.
So what's the reason why a millionaire should get that basic income as well? Wouldn't it be, for example, better, say the basic income would be, I don't know, $500 a month or something like that. Wouldn't it be better to cut away the millionaires from that income and give a few of the poorest $1,000? Wouldn't that be a better thing to do?
If you want to do that, you just tax the millionaires later. So it's more efficient to give everybody the money, and that way you're sure that anyone who needs the money has it. And then people who you think don't deserve the money or can't benefit from the money, you can just tax them later, and it's the same thing, because economically the net transfer effect, that's what actually matters for their income. I would also point out that macroeconomically, it's not necessarily true that not giving the rich person the money or taking more money away from the rich person, that doesn't necessarily free up more money for the ordinary consumer. It could, depending on the scenarios that we're in. But what allows us to give a poor person more basic income is more production of goods, more goods being produced by businesses for them to buy with the money. It's not clear to me that taxing, like taking away, reducing the basic income from the rich people actually gives us more basic income to poor people. That would be pretty rare, I think, pretty unusual.
Yeah, so gotcha. So that's so that you're quite a unique universal basic income advocate in my book. So the ones in the news basically claim that there needs to be, and they're saying like €1,000 a month for everybody. So that's what I'm used to, and the aim is to provide basic dignity and human needs. And well, that amount, €1,000, well, that makes sense. Where we're from, that buys you, well, 3-4 meals a day and a small apartment and some pocket money for clothes and so on. So that's a very basic need. But you're saying we just need to figure out X amount, and that could be a really small amount, basically, that would also be within the scope of this, one that wouldn't cover the basic needs. So you wouldn't have any objection if that amount that we can afford for some reason or another, this is basically a thought experiment, for some reason or another would be, I don't know, $250.
Sure. So we could imagine a scenario where, say, an asteroid hits the economy and destroys 90% of our businesses overnight. So in that scenario, whatever level of basic income we were at before would have to reduce, or you would cause inflation because you've lost most of your goods. Now, you might be trying to make the case that, if we put in a basic income today, it's going to top out low. I don't believe that. I think it's probably quite high. Because any time that you have any amount of automation in the economy or any technological advancement, any efficiency gain, you can afford a little bit more basic income. You can afford a little more unconditional benefit, which allows people maybe to work less if they want to. You have more room to play with there. So I can imagine a scenario in which, like, we're very desperate for labor and we can't afford to be giving people all this money because there's not enough goods and we'll run out of labor. I just don't think that's the economy we live in. I think we have a really, really prosperous, efficient economy. It's just that our way of distributing that wealth is through the labor market. And that's a really inefficient way to distribute the wealth. It's simpler and more efficient to do it with basic income.
So this is actually very, very interesting. So it's basically a dividend paid out to every American citizen based on, I don't know, GDP or something, right?
Well, I would base it on the output of the economy. So, I would tie it to basically as it becomes a policy lever, kind of like monetary policy today. But I would say, just to clarify, I mean, that is my personal decision about how to decide the amount. But what I'm arguing for is not radically different from what most UBI advocates advocate for, which is a regular amount of money that goes unconditionally to every person. So that's the basic income. And the only question is, what amount is appropriate. And some people might say $1,000 a month is a good amount. And I would just say, well, we should let that be an economics decision. It should be the optimal amount. We don't want to actually harm our economy by putting in too much money, and we don't want to keep people unnecessarily poor or unnecessarily overworked because the basic income is too low.
So what if the percentile that would be appropriate or doable is on the high side of things? Suppose it's $2,500 or maybe $4,000 a month. Would that be appropriate for everyone to just receive no questions asked?
Of course, because if you can sustain it, if you're not causing inflation, what that means is, so income is increasing, the general price level remains stable. So all you're doing is you're activating more production. So you've actually just increased the efficiency and the output of your economy. You've made more goods for people. You've produced more goods for people. And that would be a good thing, right? You would think that would be a good thing. Most people assume that's a good thing. The problem today is that most people are assuming that what really matters is employment. Like, we need to keep people working and we don't want to give them too much money. And I would just say, who's formally employed and who isn't, none of that really matters. What matters is, can we produce more goods in aggregate? Can we deliver more goods to people? So, wherever that number tops out, I would say, that's pretty good. And even if we don't immediately take my recommendation and top it out, anything is better than nothing. A little bit of basic income will help people more than a $0 basic income. $0 basic income is pretty bad for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, gotcha. And so this money is printed.
Yes. Well, that's my theory. Some people might say you need to tax to print the money, but I would remind people that the ability of the government to spend money, it doesn't have to do with how much tax revenue they've accumulated. It has to do with how productive is the economy? Are you producing goods? And it doesn't matter how many people you tax or how much you tax them. If your economy is not producing more goods, you can't spend more money, whether that money is quote unquote printed or not. Inflation is a real thing and it needs to be understood and respected.
Yeah, gotcha. So if I may, because this is kind of another way of looking at universal basic income that I'm used to saying, we have the GDP of a country. Let's say it's a couple of billion, $100 billion. A certain percentage of that is taken, and then that money is printed and given out as a dividend to every, adult citizen of the United States. And you think that's sustainable because it's based on the production of last year?
Well, it's sustainable. Whether the money is printed or not, and whether or not it's a UBI payment or any other kind of payment, government payment, what makes it sustainable is private sector production. So businesses that will take the money and give you goods in exchange. So, that's true for basic income. It's also true for military spending, right? Like you could have a huge military, but if you've made your military so big that you're now putting more payments into the economy than there are goods to claim, well, you're now going to have inflation or other problems. And we've actually seen that in wartime when people sort of overclaim capacity. So, there's no reason. We know that some level of basic income is sustainable because some level of government spending in general is sustainable. And there's no fundamental difference between a UBI payment and a welfare payment or a payment wage to a social worker or a wage to a soldier. These are all basically the same in that it's money the government gives people in the private sector that doesn't have anything to do with private sector work. It just works because it's activating more private sector production.
Yeah, okay. So I got you. So now I understand what you're talking about. So, I would say like that basic income would impact how much people would work because if people get a basic income that would sustain their lifestyle, I'm not this much of a capitalist, but they do have less incentive to work. For example, a person working 5 days a week would start working 4 days a week. Now, provided there's significant employment, that would cut back production, because employees are the motor of production, by, 20%, roughly. If everybody worked 1 day less out of the 5 days in a week, there's already a hit of 20% in production if people make that choice en masse. So wouldn't that create huge problems with these vast up and down movements in production? So 1 year the basic income is $2,500, people stop working. falls back to 1200, people start working again, and so on and so forth.
So it's certainly true that I think some basic income advocates will push back and say, no, basic income doesn't cause people not to work. It's certainly true, I should point out, that basic income has an advantage over unemployment insurance or other conditional benefits here, because unlike those, you're not paying people not to work. You're just giving them money and then they could work. So there's actually, I would argue, many current benefits do actually provide a disincentive to work in a way that basic income does not. But it is true that the higher you raise the basic income, the less people will feel that they're forced to work. So if you want to make more money, you might go get a job, but then you're not going to feel like you have to quite as much. And that's true, that might actually lead to a reduction in employment in aggregate. And I would say that's fine as long as output doesn't fall. If we can increase output with decreasing employment, what that means is we have a more efficient economy, what some people call an automated economy. And all that means is that we're actually reducing unnecessary jobs from the economy. One of the big problems in our economies is that we are technically creating as many unnecessary jobs as possible. It's actually the formal goal of most policymakers, because we sort of assume that, like, if people are working, that they're working productively. But that's not actually true. Especially, it's not true if you're using government policy to achieve a state of full employment. The big problem in our economies today is we have a lot of unnecessary jobs and a lot of unnecessary poverty. And the optimal level of basic income just allows us to fix that problem. So now we have more output with the correct level of work instead of the maximum amount of work.
But in private sector, what's the proof that there's a lot of unnecessary work? I mean, every private company has a huge incentive to cut back on unproductive work. I agree with you that some people are not happy with the job because it's monotonous, but it is productive for the company. And I mean, these movements in production, I mean, you're putting the cart a bit in front of the horse when you say, like, okay, there's just going to be automation. That automation is not there yet. So on a year-by-year basis, production will have huge up and down swings, as well as basic income. And while people have a less incentive to work, that's pretty obvious, right? So
it's important to understand that the current levels of employment, now this isn't necessarily true, but in our global economy, the current level of aggregate employment doesn't have that much to do with how much labor the economy needs. It has to do with full employment policy targets. So we've determined, central banks and governments have determined that the best goal for the economy is full employment. And now, so debt stimulus, which is basically controls how much money enters the economy and where it enters in the economy, that is adjusted to achieve full employment. So you can think of it this way: there's two ways for a business to stay in business. It can make profit selling goods to people, or you can make debt cheaper. So you could just make it really, really, really easy and cheap to get loans to keep the business going. And so that lever, the cheapness of debt, is what central banks have used following the Great Depression, where there wasn't a lot of jobs around. Central banks have stepped on this debt lever to create as many businesses as possible. You're correct that any individual business does what's efficient for it, but the total state of business in the economy is a policy decision. It reflects monetary policy choices. And we've decided that, the thing to do is achieve full employment. And I just think that we're only have to do that because we assume that people get their money from jobs. So we're sort of using jobs as income delivery systems, and not because people actually want those goods, and not because there might be more potential to produce more goods, make businesses more profitable with more expensive debt, right? That would be fine. And we're just not pursuing that option.
Yeah, I get your vision on that, pumping money into the economy. But I mean, the cheap money, the actual policy aim is not just creating jobs, but creating new businesses or creating investment and expansion of existing businesses. While the big policy failure in that is that those loans are used nowadays, at least, for what they call stock buybacks, for example, companies buying back their own stock using cheap loans.
Right. which is a disadvantage. When you have really, really, really cheap debt, what you're going to do is, you've probably heard a lot of people complaining about Wall Street and the big banks and all this stuff. And the answer is that, like, well, yeah, private debt has a really important role in the economy, facilitating productive, profitable investment. But if debt is cheap enough, then more of the economy's attention is going to be towards the Wall Street money printers, as I call them, the debt creation and cheap private sector debt lending. That's going to become more incentivized. Whereas the other option, right? The other option would be, well, you let consumers have more money. And so when consumers have more money, it's easier for businesses we can figure out which businesses are productive and which ones aren't more easily, because it's easier for them to sell goods to people, to people who want to buy the goods. So that's kind of a choice we have available. And as a quirk of history, we've chosen to maximize employment through debt as opposed to output through spending.
Right. Can you justify why it should be printed, though? Because the way you first explained it, I was like, oh, this is a good idea. Basically, your whole country becomes one big co-op. People get a dividend, not even based on participation, but just based on being a citizen.
A shareholder, you could call it. Some people justify it that way, yeah.
Why print the money? Because that leads to inflation. That leads to this whole spiel about production faltering, and it's kind of weird.
Well, I usually like to just say the government should spend the money. I don't usually call it printing, because what a lot of people don't understand is that all money is quote unquote printed. It's created. So money can be created in a lot of ways. Most of our money is created by private banks and Wall Street today in our system. A very, very tiny percentage of money is created by the government printing money, and an even smaller percentage of that government spending is the amount of money that is taxed. So all government spending creates money. If the government is spending more than it taxes, then that's not really different than printing money. But it's also, where do you draw the line between what counts as printed money or not? If a bank gives somebody a loan and puts new liquidity into the system, is this printed money? Well, technically, it's the creation of new money, if you listen to how bankers describe the process. So, most of what we consider money is just bank debt, right? So it's important to understand that the economy works because more money is created than is destroyed over the long term. And the only question is, what's the most efficient way to create money?
Well, I'm not sure if you follow, because the way I understand money printing works, or money creation works, is basically a company or a private actor borrows money to the state. That creates a paper of debt, an obligation, I think it's called, but that may be the Dutch pronunciation of that. And that obligation is basically bought up by the central bank. So basically, the central bank evaluates the private company lending the money to the state. So there's a sort of tripartite structure going in where the central bank evaluates the company lending the money to the state, thus creating the money.
Well, not in most economies. I think if the central bank is actually making like credit decisions, lending decisions, like that's not how most economies work. I don't know the specifics. It might vary country to country, but basically how central banks work is they use monetary policy, which is, interest rate adjustments and, government bonds. They use those tools to alter the rate at which all private lending firms create money in the economy. And private banks, private firms, they create money as a byproduct of making a loan. So when they loan to any actor, when they create a deposit in that actor's account, the borrower's account, that for the borrower, that's now new money, and it's collected as profit by other people in the economy. That actually creates new money. There's a really, really wonderful essay by the Bank of England called Money Creation in the Modern Economy in 2014, and that explains sort of how this all works. And it's, in order to say that some money is printed, some money is not, you sort of have to draw this line between, well, what counts as money, right? Is the government's base money, is that the only thing that counts as money? And the reality is that, what inflation cares about is spending money. And that could originate as bank credit or something else. But what matters is, how much money is being spent in the economy. And it doesn't matter, what actually counts as money or not.
So in the United States, does the central bank buy up government bonds? Yes or no?
The central bank um, and the Treasury together issue government bonds into the market, and the amount. So these, if you look at government debt, right, government bonds, treasuries, and things like that, um, the the amount of government debt and the interest paid, the interest payments those financial instruments give to people in the private sector, that is actually manipulated as part of monetary policy. So you might think that, oh, the government just spends, the government has to borrow anytime it spends, but actually the total amount of outstanding government debt on the market is based on what's appropriate for monetary policy. The central bank's deciding how much money should we be motivating people to not lend into the private sector. This is actually how we control inflation, and a lot of people aren't aware of that. And I wasn't aware of that for a long time, and it kind of blew my mind when I learned about it.
Yeah, so I think that is vastly different than what happens in the European Union. So, so we can't really harmonize on that, because that means you would have
Well,
to educate.
I think it's the same. It's the Bank of England. It works this way. In England, it works this way. And most central bank government relationships that I'm aware of.
Well, what happens is the European Central Bank buys government bonds, but the government bonds are issued by the governments. So, for example, the German government issues them, private actors loan the money, and then the central bank buys up those government bonds from the private actors.
Oh yeah, the central bank can buy government bonds. The point is that they're going to do that as a function of monetary policy objectives. So they're thinking, how much inflation do we want in the private sector right now, and that goes into their decisions about how many government bonds to buy up versus how many government bonds they're letting go onto the market.
Exactly. Okay, then we're on then we're on the ball. Okay. Excuse me. Let's talk a bit about redistribution. So where I'm from, basically, we tax everybody. We tax through consumer spending. We tax through incomes, various kinds of incomes. For example, your dividends, your wages, that kind of stuff. And should you become jobless, first we have a collective insurance where every employer pays into. That runs out in 2 years. It pays out less and less as that progresses. I'm sure you guys have a similar system. And after that, you have this is income of last resort, which is around about €1,000 paid out by the municipality, and it's condition tested on whether or not you're responding to job openings 5 times a week. That's basically the gist. Some exceptions made for people who will fall into mental illness and that kind of stuff. They don't have to respond to job openings as much. That's basically how we do it. Works perfectly. Everybody is insured of a basic, income. It's just not called like that because it's not given out to anyone. Isn't that just a better way of making sure everybody has a basic needs met?
Well, if you're making it conditional upon ensuring that everyone is checking 5 times a week to try to find employment, I mean, I guess I would ask. Look, first off, let me just say the social programs that you guys have in Europe in general are sort of vastly superior to what we have in the U.S. We do have similar things. I mean, in the U.S., we also have conditional, what you might call workfare, right? Or it's conditional on either that you're seeking jobs or appearing to seek jobs or filling out the forms, right? And, I guess we can just ask, like, is this the most efficient way to go about it? Is it the best way to go about it? Why is it so important to us that people are seen to be working rather than receiving the benefit that the economy can produce for them? And I would say it's not important. If the economy can produce more benefit for them, then we could always adjust those payments higher. And there's no reason to make it, like if you're expecting people to go and work for it, then you might remove the benefit if they don't, or if they fail to do that. And I would see no reason for that. The point of the economy is to make people more prosperous. It's not just to keep people busy. So, we want to select people's busyness based on what's actually most productive for the economy. We don't necessarily, it doesn't matter that everyone is working. And certainly the unemployment benefits that you guys have there, I'm familiar with a lot of the support systems. My friend lives in Germany, and when I hear about the things they have, it's like, this is crazy. Yeah, all you really have to do is sort of go through a certain number of motions, and then you are helped out. And that's obviously superior to what we do here. And I think it's why you guys enjoy a better standard of living in general. But I think you kind of only need to do all those things if you don't have a more efficient mechanism for making sure that people have enough spending money in general. And so it's sort of like we've gone about it backwards. Like if we started by just giving people money because we can and because it helps the economy, then then that would actually make those systems more efficient, and it would free up. We could actually use government spending for other things. We could invest in other ways, free up that spending for something else, and we don't have to use those welfare workers' times to check if people are working or not. You can have them employed doing something else. So that's my general perspective on it.
Gotcha. But so a conservative response would be, well, that's not very meritocratic, right? People who should be rewarded by their production. How do you feel about that one?
Well, so I think that people have very different kind of moral feelings about what people sort of deserve money for. So there's two sides of it. One side is all about meritocracy. So it's like you should only get money when you've proved that you're worthy of it, right? In the market or something like that. And then the other side might say, well, you should only get money if you're so destitute that you can't perform in the market. And I guess for me, these are just sort of shortcuts. These are like shorthand. It's like, oh, well, yeah, well, it's not useful to give people money because they appear to be merit it. It's useful to give people money as an incentive for them to do useful work. So profits and wages serve an important economic function. They're useful to the economy, and that's why you pay out wages or profits or collect profits, because it actually helps the economy work. Whereas if someone's just sort of demonstrating a moral, like, oh, I'm going to work, right? That's not as useful to the economy. And conversely, maybe there'd be fewer people in a position who would need the government handouts if they just had the money, right? So I guess I would just say, like, when people talk about what people deserve or merit, like, those are kind of just shortcuts for what actually improves everyone's well-being. What really matters is, are we helping people or not? Is the economy performing better or is it performing worse, right? That's how I feel about it.
I'm not sure if I agree there. Let me run this thought experiment by you. So suppose you have a surgeon. I think a surgeon makes about 8,000 a month, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So okay. So in your model, it's conceivable that everybody gets a basic income of 2,000, right?
Sure.
Isn't it a bit weird that you just get, well, 1/4 of a very hard job, which merits a lot of study and is very important and supportive of things we find important? A surgeon helps people in an incredibly complicated way. Why just get 1/4 of that just as a nice little extra? I don't follow that.
Well, you said they're making 8,000 a month, right?
Roundabout, yeah.
So that would be 8,000 a month on top of the basic income. So they're doing, by definition, anyone who works even a little bit is making more money than the person who just decides, I'm not going to work at all and live on the basic income. So I don't necessarily see a problem with that, because that person he wouldn't be a surgeon if you didn't pay him anything. He would be the surgeon if you pay him 5,000, maybe 6,000, right? However much is necessary to get him to do the work. So you reward them with the wage, and otherwise they wouldn't do it. So I think that it's fine in that scenario. I don't see why we would compare those two things in that way.
Wouldn't people just demand higher pay grades then, and wouldn't that lead to inflation? Because, well, that money has to come from somewhere, right?
So I would say that certainly basic income, and certainly a high enough level of basic income, will affect wages in the economy, I would emphasize that it will probably drive some wages up and other wages down. If you are doing really difficult, undesirable, or dangerous work, you're probably going to be able to be paid more. On the other hand, if the work you're doing is like very prestigious or you enjoy it on some level, I mean, maybe we'll determine that the employers will find that they can reduce the wage for you. But the important thing to understand is that from the employer's perspective, they never want to pay out any higher a wage than necessary. They're only going to want to pay out the wage that they need to motivate the person to do the work. It doesn't really matter what society feels about that work. It's all about what someone is willing to pay for them. And again, remember that the basic income can't be too high that we cause inflation. If it's so high that, prices are going up, wages are getting pushed up across the board instead of just some sectors, then you've miscalculated. The basic income is too high. It has to always be low enough so that wages and profits remain useful as incentives.
I just didn't expect it. Every time you open your mind, I feel myself coming over more and more to your side. So,
well, this is how I felt when I ran into people who told me about this perspective.
Yeah, so it's completely different than, because you have to know where I'm coming from. Like,
yes.
Actually, the main advocate for universal basic income is an international celebrity, Rutger Bregman. You know him?
Yes.
Ah, well, there you go. So when I saw him in the Netherlands, he basically propagated, well, we just give everybody €1,000, no questions asked, and the main way this was going to be financed is by cutting back on state employees, right?
Right.
And, well, I mean, I thought this was just a crazy story because he didn't actually came up with any numbers of what that cost, anything about the inflation, that kind of stuff. But, I mean, you know him. Do you actually agree with him, or is it just some...
Well, look, let me put it this way. Anyone who's saying the words basic income in a positive way is intuiting that there's something cool and useful here. I just think that they haven't really fully thought it through. When someone says, oh, in order to pay for the basic income, we will cut these programs, I mean, I think what they're understanding, which is something I agree with, which is that it's probably the case that many or some social welfare programs we only sort of need because we're failing to pay out a basic income. And maybe if you put in a basic income, you can reduce those things. But it's foolish to try to say there's no need to guess ahead of time what those are. The point is that you can put in some level of basic income, and then if you make people less poor, so they need less food stamps, then the caseload of food stamps programs will drop. So you don't have to cut out the food stamps in the beginning to afford it. You put in the basic income, and then we can look around and say, oh, well, do we not need some of these services anymore? Like, did the caseloads drop to zero? If they did, then you can cut that program and put it into the basic income. But I think it's a bad idea to sort of frame it as the basic income cuts out the welfare spending, because obviously if you did the welfare cutting first, you would just send millions of people into precarity and poverty, and that would be pointless.
Yeah, I don't want to get too much into him, but he also mentioned that he didn't have a proper answer to, the differentiation between basic income, because he was really advocating on, people need a basic dignity, and, you can provide that for handicapped people on €1,100 a month income. So there were all kinds of holes in his story. What I want to close off with, and I mean, this might be a bit of a long talk, but what do you think is the main reason that in a prosperous society this just doesn't happen? Because I can sort of guess it creates a lot of economic chaos when you would first implement this, because wages would go all over the place. The wage picture would look completely different, exactly because what you just told us. People who do dirty jobs could demand way more, and certain people could.
Yeah.
So what would need to happen for people to actually step over that? Because you can't wait until the economy gets really bad and people are ready for a revolution, because then you wouldn't have a production to have a dignified basic income from. So you need to do this in a prosperous, almost automated country, right?
Well, so this is why, to address the chaos concern, this is why I advocate for a calibrated basic income. So what that means is you introduce the basic income at any arbitrarily low amount. It doesn't really matter. I mean, I think €1,000 a month is fine, but it could be lower than that. The point is that you do it with the intention of gradually raising it while economic indicators are tracked. And this is very analogous to contemporary monetary policy. We alter these things. We make debt cheaper, more expensive every month if we need to. And it should be the same with basic income. And if you do that, then there's not really any potential. Like if there was bad chaos in society, you would predict this would show up in loss of output, loss of necessary labor, loss of or causes of inflation. So you just adjust it so that none of those things occur. And there might be some. Certainly, I think this would socially, ethically be an adjustment for people to kind of realize, like, oh, well, it's not really so much about what we deserve. It matters what's possible and what's the most helpful thing we can do. And that might change. That might be uncomfortable for some people. And I think it's worth discussing that and taking that seriously. But economically, if you're calibrating it properly, then there isn't really potential for economic chaos.
So you are saying it's not a moral question. It's not about, as you said, what we deserve, just about what we can afford. And you're hoping that that's a lot because, well, high-tech society and all that. But if you do this in a rural medieval society, it, of course, would be a bit less... Gotcha. And this was just something that popped into my head. This is something completely different than UBI, but wouldn't you get similar results with, this is a bit of a socialist point. I'm not a socialist, but I hang out with some, just collectivizing and co-opting key parts of the infrastructure. For example, if the electrical network would be a national co-op and you pay dividend from that, every part of the productional chain would need energy, and if you just pay out dividends based on the energy consumption in a certain country, you would have a similar system. You would get payments based on what's being produced in the country, pro rata, right?
Well, I don't know if I would call that a socialist position. I actually know people in the U.S. who are more capitalist who take that approach and say we should tie the dividend payment to like a national wealth fund or collectivized utility interest, things like that, and pay it out that way. And I would just say the problem with that is, if any particular source of the sovereign wealth fund, any particular stock performance rises or falls, that might not necessarily, well, then your dividend falls or rises, but that's not necessarily what's best for the economy as a whole. And the basic income goes to everyone. It's across the entire economy. It's not just about that one company or that one, utility or whatever it is. So there's no guarantee that so for example, you get a scenario where the payment is falling and now the economy has less consumer spending for no reason except that those particular, utilities were not necessary anymore or something like that. So, it's just like these are kind of ways we could come up with to justify paying out the basic income, but they're not related to economically what's optimal.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. Actually, like I said, I seem to feel myself coming over to your side a lot. So this is kind of maybe the start of a bit of a journey for me. So I really appreciate that. But it does leave me, of course, a bit confused, having an eye opener like that. So I'll have to credit myself a bit after this one. We have. Could you share in chat or something like that some required reading or something like that, something that I could use to sort of inform myself about the nitty gritty? Because I feel somehow a bit overloaded with information. A lot of terms I wasn't expecting to coming around. I was actually expecting quite a sort of basic Rutger Bregman kind of conversation as you were taking from
right. But yeah, no problem at all. I'll send you the literature that I've found helpful, and we can talk about it later. And I'm if you have any other questions about it, let me know anytime. Thank you for having this conversation. I'm very eager to talk to more people about this because what I'm describing is not known by very many people at all. It's very unknown at the moment.
Yeah, you're a good advocate. So that's this is actually fantastic. So yeah, well, I'll definitely keep in touch. Anyway, thank you so much, man. It was a pleasure, and I'll keep in touch. Don't be a stranger.
Likewise. I'm looking forward to next time.
See ya.
Have a good one.